Well, in this video, I'm going to take just a few minutes to reflect on where church history has been over the last 20 to 30 years and where it comes up to the present. There's a lot that could be said, but there's a few things that I'd like to focus on, things that I think, on one hand, show some significant evolution in church history over the last generation. That's really what we're thinking here, about one generation, maybe 20, 25, 30 years or so. And some things that are honestly neutral, that are not necessarily good or bad, just some observations that I'll make. But some things are a bit more concerning. But one thing I want to mention at the end is one thing that gives me great hope and great optimism as I look ahead at church history. One thing that I'll mention is going back to really my early years. In the 1980s, I was born in 1984. And through the 1980s and 90s, in American Christianity, and I'm primarily speaking about the American scene here so that I can narrow things a bit, at least in this initial part of the video, one thing that was notable was that there was a substantial evangelical subculture in America. And I don't merely mean that in the way that we speak about fundamentalism as being really sort of sectioned off. But within American evangelicalism, it had become large enough and it had become resourced enough that it had its own popular music, its own radio channels, its own awards shows, its own music venues, concerts, and so on and so forth that really would have been all over the United States. This wasn't something just in the South or in the Midwest. I grew up in Northern California, and a very large theme park in the 1990s, once a year, would be not closed off, but would have a whole theme of popular Christian music, of what we just called Christian music. It was CCM, Contemporary Christian Music, and they would have all kinds of Christian concerts all over the Great America theme park. And I look back at that wouldn't happen today. That would be strange today in a place like Silicon Valley. But in the 1980s and 90s, there was this substantial evangelical subculture, again, that had its own, some of it's even its own language, not only, but again, eventually in the early 2000s, began having films and so on and so forth. And it's not to say that that's non-existent anymore, but it seems to have been in a decline, with the exception of film. Actually, I mentioned that actually has continued to develop. It's something that could be really a video in itself, evangelical film in America over the last, especially 15 years or so. But and of course Christian music, and there's still Christian radio and those things, but not on the level. I think that for those of you who might be 25 or younger, might not be able to appreciate without some research into just how prominent this was. Large concert venues, significant TV presence, not always within mainstream culture. Again, it was a subculture, but it wasn't isolated in the way that fundamentalism was. And in so many ways, it was drawing from and making, whether it was music, whether it was clothing, whether it was different styles, they were in so many ways, to be honest, sort of mimicking the broader culture, but putting a Christian spin on it, sort of baptizing it. And that was a part of American evangelicalism that was very prominent, that is not completely gone today. But one observation that I would have is that culture has declined some, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is that evangelicalism has become a smaller piece of the pie culturally, just numerically. It's not that evangelicalism numerically has declined significantly, but it has not kept up with population growth. So as the United States has continued to grow substantially over the last generation, numerically, according to population, it's not that evangelicalism has declined in the way that mainline Protestantism, liberal Protestantism has. Evangelicalism has been somewhat plateaued, but then as America grows, it becomes a smaller section. Another thing is that just the children in evangelical churches and those of evangelical families don't seem to imbibe sort of this subculture in the same way. And so much more that could be said on that, but that's one observation. Connected to that, or at least related to that, is a decline in denominationalism, denominational loyalty. It's not to say that denominations have gone away. Of course they haven't, and I don't see them going away anytime soon. But in basically, if you look back before the 1980s, for instance, in the South, you would have had great loyalty to the Southern Baptist Convention, to the United Methodist Church, and so on and so forth. And this would have been true broadly. I'm pointing at the South because the South is the Bible Belt. That's where Christianity had the largest presence per capita. But it's not that, again, it's not that that's gone away, but sociologists, this is not my own insight here, sociologists have understood this broadly, has been the case that denominational loyalty is not what it was a generation ago. And I see that continuing to just move in that direction in terms of a de-emphasis on denominationalism. And by that, I don't simply mean most people are now non-denominational or they don't belong to a denomination. Oftentimes they do, but it's more for convenience rather than for a really strong sense of denominational loyalty. It's more for convenience of a location or of a particular type of church or a particular pastor rather than I'm a Presbyterian because my parents were Presbyterian and I was raised Presbyterian, I was baptized Presbyterian, that's why I'm Presbyterian. That has been less so today. Not entirely gone, but less so. As well as the rise of non-denominational churches and the continuing existence of Bible churches and others that would want to spur that name. These churches that are non-denominational, Bible churches or interdenominational, these sort of churches in many ways epitomize evangelical Christianity. They are not without a tradition. They belong in so many ways to evangelical Christianity, and yet they do not, they don't want to claim it. So that included, but also, again, many people who would belong to a Southern Baptist church, but not even necessarily know, is this church Southern Baptist? And I don't know, and what does that mean? And so that's an interesting dynamic that has continued, and I think will continue to be the case. Evangelicalism has always been interdenominational. You have different denominations that are able to partner and come together under this broader conception of evangelicalism, and I think that will continue to be the case in the days ahead. One thing that's most notable in the late 20th century and accelerating over the last 20 years as we get deeper into the 21st century is the decline of cultural Christianity. Now, that's not news to you. You've already surely been aware of this, and if we haven't mentioned it much in this class, it's because it seems so obvious, perhaps. Now, if you're in a place like Los Angeles, if you're in a place like Phoenix, if you're in a place like Seattle, certainly, if you're in a place like Philadelphia, any major American city, you might not feel it as prominently. It maybe feels like it's already been very secular, and that was certainly the case for where I grew up. But statistically and honestly, just as we observe culture, just with an insight into observing American culture around us, there has been a significant reduction in the power of a cultural Christianity in American life. I could make this whole video just on this, but I want to mention it along with these others to just simply state the fact that the days of public Christianity, when someone like Reinhold Niebuhr or Karl Barth would be on the cover of Time magazine, that would seem very strange today. It was very normal a few generations ago. But over the last a couple generations, and as I said, as we get into the 21st century, it has accelerated that sort of people who would identify as Christian merely by some sort of affiliation of family or some vague connection themselves, that has been less so the case in our own time. And related to that is really the passing of what was a whole generation of people seeking to build churches upon that cultural Christianity, what we call the seeker-friendly movement or the seeker movement, mostly connected to megachurches. That time has passed. It's not just that it's passing or it will pass, but I would say that time has passed. Not to say that megachurches have disappeared, but no one is building megachurches anymore. That was in the 1990s, the beginning of the 80s, and especially in the 90s and in the early 2000s, megachurches seemed to be the future of American Christianity. That's no longer the case. They are not only no longer being built, but many of them are declining, and some of them are closing. And so that was an episode, that was a chapter in American Christianity, and yet in our time, that time seems to be passing. Again, it's not to say that there won't be large churches in the future. But that is no longer thought to be what will be the norm, and it simply doesn't pencil out in a place where cultural Christianity has continued to decline, maybe accelerated its decline. even in the Bible Belt, even in places where it had been very prominent. A couple more thoughts before I get to what I want to say is my most optimistic point. Is that over the last 5 to 10 years, so I'm getting very recent now, I'm speaking in 2023, in spring of 2023, is the redrawing of the lines of American evangelicalism. And by that, I mean within what has been a fairly broad spectrum theologically, from a very far right to a somewhat more progressive left, and a whole lot of in between in this strata. Over the last 5 to 10 years, there's been a significant amount of redrawing of lines and renegotiating where different people fit tribally within some sort of the subgroups of American evangelicalism. For instance, related to things like critical race theory and intersectionality. And really, honestly, although I'm naming those things just because those are still buzzwords as I'm speaking, but more importantly, it's how Christianity relates to culture, how culture relates to the church, how society relates to politics, and all of those things together has in many ways forced some increased tribalism and some redrawing of lines and negotiation, with some moving further to the left, some leaving evangelicalism entirely, what are called ex-evangelicals. Some of them will take on that verbiage, but also many that are moving further to the right into what is sort of a neo-fundamentalism. And then again, a lot of people in the middle that are not quite sure where they fit, and yet there's no doubt that lines have been redrawn in the last several years, the last decade at least. So much of these tensions have been related to politics, and if I had time, again, could easily do a whole video on that. But I'll leave that as it is, and you can do some more research on your own. The last thing I want to mention is one of the things that gives me the most sense of optimism as I look ahead, and that is the emergence of the global church. Christianity has always been a global movement. You know that by now, especially if you've taken the first section of church history. But here in church history too, in this second section, since the Reformation, you have seen how Christianity has spread and grown globally. Well, in the last century and a bit more, it is accelerated, has continued, and the global South, the Christianity of the world outside of the West, is the future of Christianity numerically in so many ways. No longer is it Western Europe and the United States. There will always, I think, for a much longer time, be a strong sense of Christianity in America because of publishing houses and seminaries and places like that. I think that will continue on over the next generation at least. And yet, so much of the energy for the church, the growth of the church, the advance for the church is actually in places like Africa and East Asia and Latin America. And so that gives me a great deal of hope that even as the church has seemed to stall in some places in the West and has seemed to be confronted in many ways, I have great hope that God will continue to bless in the global South, and that there's much that we can learn from our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. So as we look ahead, we know that God is on the move and that his providence continues. And yet what we get to do as historians and junior historians in this class is to analyze these things carefully and seek what we can learn from them and how we can apply it to our lives and ministry.